right, welcome. Here we are at accurately handling the word of truth as it is found in 1 Corinthians 11, 22 through 24 tonight. Let's just get started. As you will recall, I left off last time talking about these private suppers where Paul says every one of you takes his own supper. And what that means is every one of you grabs or seizes his private supper. And private supper, as I said, is an actual name of a certain kind of horrendous kind of meal that the Romans had, and I described it last time, and even one of their own described their private suppers as monstrous and dog-like. I'm not going to get any further into that, but I'm going to just make a few more thoughts about this. If you go to your last week's guide page, the 5th page, you will see where it says private suppers on the top of it. Greg, you probably aren't going to have that because it's last week's. It's last time's. We'll get to that one also. Are there some left over there? I don't know if there are. I think they're the second ones. What I want to point out is that what the Corinthians were calling the Lord's Supper, now Paul says you were taking your private supper, but the Corinthians had written to him and said, yes, we're taking the Lord's Supper. And Paul has already said, what you're doing is not the Lord's Supper. What the Corinthians were calling the Lord's Supper had degenerated into a Roman private supper where the social have-nots devoured their own meal and drank themselves into a stupor. Oh, by the way, this is a quote from a Cambridge professor of New Testament studies. This paragraph, he said this himself. When he was studying Corinth and 1 Corinthians, he said that it degenerated into a private supper where the social haves devoured their own meal and drank themselves into a stupor on their own wine, while the hungry low-class have-nots were left to look on as slaves did at a private supper. That was Bruce Winter. He's a well-known professor at Cambridge. He saw this as well. The thing that I want to point out is that, as I said the last time, there was no love in their love feasts, because they did not call it the Lord's Supper. They called it the agape. And there was no love in it at all. It was a monstrous and dog-like affair. It just reminded me so much of 1 John 3:17, where it says this, because this describes the Corinthian situation to a T. Whosoever hath this world's goods, okay, there was the haves that had lots of food and brought it to the meal, has this world's goods, and seeth his brother have need. They were right there in front of them. They were eating right in front of them. They could see the brothers that were hungry and had nothing. And seeth his brother have need, and shutteth up his bowels of compassion. This is the thing. I tell you what, there was no compassion. I mean, these guys were callous and brutal. And they were born and raised that way, and their fathers before them were too. It was just how it shuts up his bowels of compassion from him. Here's the question: how dwelleth the love of God in him? Well, there ain't no love in them. And this is the thing that Paul was so stirred up about here, is that everything that the Lord's Supper was to promote and was to demonstrate, they were demonstrating the absolute worst opposite. All right, on to the next page. The supper that is described in the upcoming verses 23 through 25, which we will get to, would most closely resemble what was called in Corinth and was called in the Roman Empire at that time. It wasn't called the private supper. It had another name for a special kind of supper that they observed and participated in. It was called the common table supper, or the koinonia, which simply means, koinonia means sharing, okay? Where each brought their own food and drink to the table, just like the Corinthians were doing, right? But each then, instead of eating it all themselves, they invited others who had less or nothing to share. They invited them to share their meal with them at their table, without any consideration of anybody's social rank, without any consideration of whether there would be anything left for them to eat after the poor and needy had eaten their fill. Now that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? And actually the Romans and around the Mediterranean, there was that kind of meal going on. But guess what? I found out. It only happened once a year. The common table meal was only observed one time a year at the Feast of Saturnalia. It meant a feast in honor of Saturn, which was a god. Okay? It's kind of like our Thanksgiving, where at Thanksgiving time, there's a lot of people who bring food to the shut-ins, volunteered to be part of providing the food and serving the food to people, to Thanksgiving dinners where the needy and the homeless, and they were intended to be fed. This is kind of what the common table supper was supposed to be, but it was a rare thing. Just didn't happen very often. But that's the agape meal was supposed to be that way. They were still supposed to bring their own meal, but instead of eating it themselves, that's where it went wrong. That's where the love was killed, right there. They brought their own meal, and then they looked around at the fellowship, looked around at everybody that was from the church there, and you will, as you will find out in verse 29, you'll find out that they were asked to discern who they should share their meal with. So they would come like the family, mother and father and the children would come, and they would come in and they would set it up on the table, and but then mom and dad would be looking around, and maybe they would invite the kids to be discerning the body of Christ, to be discerning the body and looking around. Who? They would be the who squad. And then when they decided, either mom and dad or the kids or whoever, because it was a family affair, they would run over to whoever it was that was the who, and they would say, Come, eat with us, come, eat, and they would be invited to eat their fill of whosever meal there was. And here's the thing about it is, without consideration for whether there would be anything left for themselves to eat or drink. Now, you got to remember who was the majority of the Corinthian church. Huge amount of slaves, a huge amount of freedmen. And I've talked to you about the lot and the sorry state of the freedmen. They were in a worse predicament than the slaves. These guys were hungry when they came to the meal. They probably hadn't had a good meal all week long. So that when those with the means to bring that meal were to look around, they had plenty of people. And guess what? They were hungry people, thirsty people. Okay? So when it says, without consideration of whether there would be anything left for them, guess what? That was a real possibility that there would not be anything left for them. Okay? But Paul, I don't know, I can get too far into this right now. I will get back to it again. But this is why he says in the next verse, he says, don't you have houses to eat in? Don't you have houses to eat in? So you bring your meal, and it's all eaten, wiped out. All there is a few paper plates left over, and they're chewing on them too. So there's nothing left over. So what? Don't you have houses to eat in? You go eat when you get home. All right. Now, here's a big consideration that we don't realize. I had to dig for this myself. That when Paul wrote this to the Corinthians, there was a famine in Corinth at that time. Guess what happens when there's a food shortage? Hoarding takes place. Especially those with something get really, really worried about keeping whatever they had. And this food shortage, hoarding would be a common occurrence in Corinth at that time. The rich who were really worried that the poor were going to rise up and take their food. Okay? That's something that was different between the time that Paul first told them about the Lord's Supper and now when he writes to them about the Lord's Supper now, is that they weren't in a food shortage 5 years before. They are in a food shortage now. I should probably tell you that it's in Acts. I believe it's in chapter. I got it written down here someplace, but it's in Acts. You remember the prophet Agabus. It says there, and I think it's chapter 8. Agabus rose up in Antioch. He was in Antioch, and he rose up and he said, he prophesied that there would be a famine throughout the whole world. Does that sound familiar to you from your reading of Acts? He said there would be a famine throughout the whole world, not just a famine in Judea, although they did send money to Judea, okay? But there was a famine throughout the whole world. That included Corinth. And it goes on to say, Luke goes on to say, because he researched it out, this took place in the reign of Claudius Caesar. Guess when Claudius Caesar was emperor? During the time that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. So this famine was real, and it was throughout the whole world, and there was hoarding going on. Whatever the rich had, they were not willing to relinquish because it could mean that they went hungry. And I think that we can see some of that in Paul's shaming of the rich when he says, don't you have houses to eat and drink in? If it's wiped out, if what you bring to the agape meal is wiped out, fine. That's what it was for in the first place. You go home and eat. Let's move on here. And the next phrase in that, in 21 there, verse 21 is, and one is hungry. Now, there are many commentators that try to minimize this statement here and say, oh, they weren't really hungry. They just got served an inferior kind of food. They had plenty to eat, but if the rich had sirloin steak, they had hot dogs. All you got to do is look at the original language. The word for hungry there doesn't mean, it means famished. It means starving. Hungry did not mean receiving inferior food. Okay, I feel a sermon coming on. I gotta keep on going here. Another is drunken. Oh boy, there's been lots said about this, but here's something you may not have considered here, is that at every private supper, there was different parts to the supper, but an important part in a private supper was the portion of the supper that was called the symposion. Okay? We get our English word symposium, which means drinking together. So you'll see it, the symposium. Jake's symposium. That means this is where you come to drink together. And that was part of every meal. And it was expected, an important part. During the symposion, during the meal, what would happen, and this is where the whole thing got started, is that somebody would stand up in the meal, raise their cup of wine that they had brought themselves, and they would say, let's drink to the memory of good old Gaius. Remember good old Gaius? Yeah, I sure miss him. And everybody was expected to either clink their glasses. I don't know if that was part of Rome or not, but anyway, they were all expected to drink in honor of the memory of good old Gaius. Okay? It was expected. Otherwise, you would be a party pooper, right? There was lots of these toasts that were done. It wasn't just one time. Like at your birthday, everybody will raise their cup of cider or juice or coffee and say, "Happy birthday, Gary." And it's one time. It's one time. This would go on for hours. They didn't care. Especially the more they drank, the more they didn't care. There was lots of these toasts. Everybody was expected to drink this toast. If you didn't, you could make enemies. It was a very peer-pressured type of situation there. What would you do if they said, "Let's drink to Gary's 95th birthday. We never thought he'd make it." And you just sat there. Okay, multiply that by many times in a Roman or Corinthian or Mediterranean atmosphere. That would be bad. Yeah, that would be bad. Offensive? Yes. You can see why some were drunk. It was hard not to be intoxicated. Okay? That's something that I don't think most people realize, is that if you were going to be a good participating part of the supper, you were going to be influenced by alcohol in a short while. Anyway, let's move on to verse 22. Here's a real biting verse. Paul says to the Corinthians who had written to him, they were expecting to be praised. You can read it right in here. You can see it between the lines in here. They wrote to Paul and said, "Yeah, we're really doing everything you told us to do, and it's wonderful." Guess who would say something like that? Those fat and rich and satisfied people. They were the ones that knew how to write. They were the ones that had the money to send a letter. There was no freedman that was saying, "Yep, it's wonderful here." They couldn't read and they couldn't write in the first place. Those that could write, they couldn't write their own letter. They only had to write what their master told them to write. They had no money to send it off anyway. It was expensive to do so. So what we've got here is we got this biting bit of irony that Paul addresses to those that had written to him. "What? Have you not houses to eat and drink in? Or despise you the church of God and shame them that have not? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I praise you not." Now this statement is calculated to shame the controllers of the church. He's addressing this. He's not addressing this to the slaves. Okay? He's not addressing this to the freedmen who were renting one little tiny room someplace and barely making ends meet. He's talking to the rich. And he was saying, he had said this in verse 17 already, and he says it again, "I refuse to praise you." You got to remember that praise was how you gathered and built up honor for yourself. And honor translated into power, because it meant that you could buy and sell with more people. You could be respected in the community. Praise was what everybody worked hard to get, and shame was what they worked really hard to avoid. So with that in mind, this statement here really shames the people it was addressed to. "I will not praise you. I will not give you honor. I withhold my applause from you." Okay? This is not the kind of thing that the elite in the Corinthian church wanted to hear. Oh, I tell you, they did not like this. I tell you what, and we can read Paul's second letter to them, and you know that they hated what he said here. They just hated it because what it did in first century Corinth is that it reduced their status in the eyes of the whole church. Now, why do I say that it reduced their status in the eyes of the whole church? We have this idea that when the three buddies from Corinth, Stephanos and the other two guys, I can't remember their names, they brought a letter to Paul, who was in Ephesus at the time. That letter was written by the rich elite people of the church, not by the slaves, not by the poor widows, not by those people. They wrote a letter to him while they were still with Paul in Ephesus. He wrote this letter back, and they carried the letter back to Corinth. Oh, we get the idea that this was like our postal service, where Paul wrote this letter and he popped it in the mail, and the postal service delivered this directly to the address of the rich and powerful Corinthian church people that had written the first letter. No. This was a hand-carried deal. So when Stephanos and the other two guys came back carrying this letter right here, this letter of 1 Corinthians back, how did the rest of the church find out about what it said? Remember, most of them couldn't read. The ones that could read, of the slaves and the freedmen, they were not allowed to read whatever they wanted. They only read what their masters wanted them to read. Okay? So how did the majority of the Corinthian church find out about what Paul said in this letter? Because it did not go to the Roman elite. It was still in the hands of Stephanos, and I wish I could remember the name of the other two guys, but it was still in their hands. They were expected, when they carried that letter back, to read it to the whole congregation, right? If I've got it written down here someplace, Colossians 4:16, Paul gives the process by which his letters became known to all the people in the churches. Where he says to the Colossians, he says, read this letter amongst yourselves, and the letter that was written to the Laodiceans, have their letter read to you. So they not only read the letter to Colossae, the people in Colossae, but Paul said, now read this letter to the Laodiceans, who were the town next over, right next door. Okay? So he was giving instructions as to the way things were done in those days, is that the one who carried the letter is the one who read the letter out loud to everybody. So what happened here is that when Paul says, what? I praise you not. Don't you know? And all these things that he says to them that he's calculated to shame them for, it was read to the whole church by the three guys who carried it there. If this letter had gone directly to the Roman elite, do you think this letter would have ever been read to the church? Not when it's got stuff like this in it. And this isn't the only thing that Paul held their feet to the fire over, okay, as you have known. That's a long way of saying that this reduced the control of the controllers over the church. Do you realize that they had absolutely no way to break out of the influence of those Roman army veterans that were in the church? They were stuck. But Paul had a way of reducing their status in the eyes of the church. He could do that. They couldn't. But he did it for them. He shamed the shamers. Okay. I love it. What a good strategy. All right. Let's see if there's anything else I got to say about that here. All right. Let's take a look at... have you not houses to eat and drink in? This question is loaded with irony. Do you know what irony is? I'll read you what Webster says that irony is. It's a sarcastic expression in which the intended meaning is the direct opposite of its usual sense. Okay? So when he says, have ye not houses to eat and drink in? He is sarcastically saying the opposite of that. He concludes in his sarcastic and ironic way, he says, the only reasonable explanation for what you're doing at the Lord's Supper meals is that you haven't got any houses to eat in. And the only good meal that you have is the once a week agape meal at church. How sarcastic. He does this sarcastic thing other places too. They were criticizing him because he wouldn't accept support from him. And what does he say? He says, I won't receive financial support from you. Forgive me this wrong. That's saying exactly the opposite of what he intended right there. Because he does this sarcastic thing to the Corinthians because this is a way that he was inspired to reduce their control over the Corinthian church, because they had it by a stranglehold. So, but the people he was saying, have you no houses? Or the very people that did have houses. But he says, it must be that you have no houses. But then he changes from irony and sarcasm to a very serious thing with one word. And I can just almost see him if he was orating this thing where he would say, I think the only reason for your behavior is because you have no houses to eat in. Or is it because, and with this small world, he tells them what he's discerned is the real reason why they have this monstrous and dog-like behavior at their meals. He says, or I know what the real reason is that you despise the church of God. Yeah. That's what Paul was hoping that the Corinthians would feel. because he rounded on them and said, "Or, I know why it is. You despise the church of God." That's discernment right there. That is discernment right there. Despise means to think down upon, to have contempt for. By devouring their food and drink in front of the famished, they were expressing the contempt that they harbored toward the church. That was a pretty effective way to do so, wasn't it? To just sit there and say, "You can't touch me. You can't touch me. I'll eat it all and you can't touch me." He had a tough crowd with the elite, the ones that were giving the problems. And then the next thing he says that he discerns is that they ate the way they did and they behaved the way they did because they were intentionally shaming those that were lower than they were, to keep them in their place. He rubbed their faces in it. You are inferior to me. Yeah, quite an agape feast, huh? What could show more contempt for the church than to deliberately and publicly humiliate the hungry church members by eating in front of them while they had to stand and watch? See, I don't think that there's many that understand the harshness of this thing that was going on in the name of love. In the name of the Spirit showed me to do this. Because if you read more in the letter of 1 Corinthians, you find out that they were saying to Paul, "We're more spiritual than you are. We should be counseling you. Who are you to counsel us?" "What should I say to you?" Paul sarcastically pretends that he is at a loss for words as to how to respond to this, but clearly he is not at a loss. In other words, this is more irony. He's saying the exact opposite of what he intended. "I don't know what to say to you." He had 17 verses worth of things to say to them about this. Shall I praise you in this? Paul puts the question to them. Should I praise you? Put yourself in my place. If I was doing these kind of things and said I was to be praised for it, would you praise me for it? Well, actually, in the weird mindset of the the Greco-Roman mind of the rich and powerful, they would probably applaud somebody for doing the kind of behavior that they did because they were that screwed up. They probably would have said, "Good job! You put them in their place. You showed them who's boss. You showed them who's the cool guys." I praise you not. This is the second time he shames the abusers of the poor in the church. If this is to be read to the whole congregation by Stephanas and the rest, this would have been calculated to result in lowering the status of those who controlled the church. And I think it was effective. It really hurt. I mean, they doubled down. They doubled down really badly on this, as you'll find out in the second letter. But it did it did do what the majority of the Corinthian church Christians could not do for themselves. Paul was championing their cause. He was saying the things that they could not say. He was reducing their status in the way that they could not do for themselves. He was their advocate. Verse 23, for I received of the Lord that which also I delivered unto you, that the Lord Jesus, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. Now that sentence should stop there. Remember verse breakup, verse divisions are not from the Lord. They're not inspired by the Holy Spirit. They're not inerrant. They're man-made. And sometimes, and many times, they do an admirable job of putting the verse divisions in the right place so it makes sense. This is just one place where it's not so much. Now, before I get into word by word, as I usually do, I got to look at this. Look at the phrase, I received of the Lord that which also I delivered unto you. This sentence is the complete description of what true prophecy is. In one little verse, he shows all the ingredients of an authentic prophecy right here. There's 5 ingredients to an authentic prophecy. Okay? Look at them in this phrase here. The first one, above all else, is the Lord. The Lord. I received of the Lord. The contents of the message must originate with the Lord. Okay? If it originates from the messenger, or if it originates from some other source, the whole stack of cards, the whole castle of cards falls down. It is not prophecy. It is not Christian, spiritual, authentic prophecy if the contents of the message do not originate with the Lord's mind. It's in His mind. He's got something on His mind. And He intends, number 2, the next ingredient is you. He intends that what's in His mind to be understood and acted upon by those who hear it, to hear the message, to hear what is in God's mind. Okay? Now, can I do this quick? Try to do this quick. Here we got God. Here we got you. Okay, God's got something on His mind here. Okay? Now, there's lots of times, and we, especially as charismatics, we love to hear about the times when God just simply shares His mind with you. Apart from anybody else. We call it, and it's the right word, revelation. I have a revelation. And as soon as you say the word revelation, you immediately understand that God spoke directly to me, and it's none of your business. I heard from the Lord. The Lord told me. I had a dream. The Lord wants me to tell you that you should, and that kind of thing. So, but that's a legitimate way that God does it. I mean, look at Mary. Now, Mary's not a good example. She fits into the other category here. But look at Paul on the road to Damascus. There was no intermediary there. It was God to Paul, Saul at the time, just that. Other places, many, many times in the Old Testament. There's lots of times in the New Testament too. When Agabus prophesied that there was going to be a famine, and it actually happened, that was a thing where that was God to Agabus. Okay? But then there's the third ingredient of an authentic prophecy, and it is I. I received of the Lord that which I delivered unto you. Okay? This is what Paul had with this account of the Lord's Supper right here. God had something on his mind. He shared it with Paul. He didn't share it with the Corinthians. God did not share that with the Corinthians. He didn't. I mean, he's God. He can do that. He can do what he wants. Okay? But in this case, God had something on his mind about that supper, and then I delivered it to you. Okay? These are the two ways that things can happen. So prophecy can happen by this way, and that seems like a more of an Old Testament thing, but it is done in the New Testament as well. Okay? But that has to be judged. Especially this, the Lord told me stuff, has to be judged. Okay? And when this I person starts throwing his weight around and says, you got to do what I say because I got it from the Lord, that needs to be judged along the way too. But they're still legitimate. God help us. We need discernment along the way. So that's the three ingredients of the three persons. There's three persons involved in a prophecy, in this prophecy. But then there is the go-between messenger. This guy that's in between, he's kind of a go-between. The Lord isn't necessarily saying, you do it. You do this. Actually, what he's saying is, you do this. You do what I've got on my mind. It's not so much here, although he better be doing it too, if he's a faithful messenger. But his job is not to do it. His job is to deliver it. His job is to deliver it. So, let's see if I can get this. He's got two jobs. I received. To receive, literally, the Greek word literally means to receive near. Or to put it so we can understand that a little bit, it means to receive by close association with. To receive by close association with is that this guy here, in order to be able to receive something from the Lord, needs to be in close association with the Lord. I received of the Lord. The only way you could do that is by being in close association. Okay? It's kind of like a virus. How do you receive it? By close association. Okay? Thing about it is that when it comes to the next part, it says the next job of the go-between messenger is, I delivered. So this guy has two jobs. And that means to give over near. Both the word for receive and the word for deliver in Greek have the word for near in it. Para is the word in both of the words for receive and near. It means you got to be near them. You got to be in close association with. And so in order for this guy who's been in close association with the Lord, and the Lord shares his mind with him on something along the way, this guy has to deliver that over to you, to the hearers of it, but he can't really do that unless he's in close association not only with God, but with you. He's got to be near God, he's got to be near the Lord to receive it, but he's also got to be near you to deliver it. This is where a lot of the prophecy movements go wrong, is that they think they can simply prophesy out without having any connection and association with the people that are telling it to. Just an aside, I just loved Chuck, where he's prophesying away. I mean, it was wonderful what he had to say, but he had a relationship with people, and he was calling them by name, because he wanted them to not only mentally get it, but he wanted them to catch it, like catching a virus, that we would catch what he had. See? And that's what this is that there has to be a close association in two directions. Lord, you, in order for prophecy to be legitimate and stay real. All right, those are the five. Those are the five ingredients that Paul has in one little statement. I think it's just great. As I said before, when I really find out what Paul was talking about, I find out Paul said it best. Okay, Paul delivered the message to the Corinthians in two ways. Do you realize that he delivered this account of the Lord's Supper to the Corinthians 2 times? 2 times. First, he delivered to them in AD 51, when he first came to Corinth. And then during the time he was with them, amongst many other things. By the way, he wasn't there just for a year and a half, because if you read on in that same chapter, you'll find out that he was there for a great, what it says, a long time after the 1.5 years. So he was with the Corinthians much longer than a year and a half. So during that time, he verbally told them the account of the upper room event. And he says he got it from the Lord. He got it prior to 15 AD. And when he came to Corinth, then he did this thing. Verbally. The first time. Verbally. Okay? He did this to introduce them to a formal set of words, get this, to a formal set of words and acts that would regularly keep all the benefits that flowed to them from the death of Christ fresh in their minds. I think that my sentence structure could be better, but I hope you get the point, is that this whole recounting of what happened in the upper room by Jesus and the disciples was put into a formal set of words and actions that they were to do regularly in order to keep it fresh in their minds, in order for them to remember. Okay? They were supposed to do this regularly, and we'll get into, we'll get there. But see, he recounted the very same message to them again, only this time in writing in 56 AD, 5 years later. And that's what we're looking at today. We're looking at the written account that's exactly a repetition of what he told them 5 years earlier. What's that? In person, verbally, 5 years in 51, in person, verbally. This time, he's doing it while absent from them in writing. But the words, according to what I've got from reading this myself, is that he says, I am writing to you the exact repetition or the exact words and actions that I showed you before. I received of the Lord that which I already delivered to you. All right? But now he's doing it a second time. Whew. God help us all. The question is, why did Paul repeat the same event to them a second time? Ever thought about that? Why would Paul write it to them after he had already told them, and probably told them and told them and told them over this quite a protracted period of time that he lived with them? Why would he again write it to them again? It wasn't because they didn't know it. If you just look a few verses earlier in this chapter, he praises them that you keep the ordinances just as I delivered them to you. They knew it. It wasn't because they had forgotten, because in that very same verse he says, you remember me in all things. And all things has to do with all the things that he had taught them. They had caught something from Paul by close association. Paul was never one to just broadcast from afar. He wanted to be there in close association so that they would catch the virus that he had. That's why these churches, he'd be there for a little while and be gone. And then there was this church that came out of it because they caught the virus. They didn't just get some information. They caught the virus by close association. He lived with them. He worked with them. Anyway, I could go on here. But the question is still, if he didn't write them a second time because they didn't know it and because they hadn't forgotten it, I'm going to propose this. He wrote it a second time to them. Remember the context that this comes out of. Starting with this verse here, it's always taken out of its context. It's always taken out of its context. When Paul first wrote to them, when he first spoke to them about this, it was to establish a formal set of words and acts that would keep keep Jesus and what he did fresh in their minds. But that was not the reason why he repeated it to them a second time. He repeated it a second time. If you remember the context, he only wrote this to them. He would not have written to this except for one thing. He had heard reports of the abuses that were happening at the Lord's Supper. That's the reason why he wrote the account the second time, is in response to the abuses that were happening at the Lord's Supper. Of course, they were saying, this is the Lord's Supper. He says, that's not the Lord's Supper. I want to show you what the Lord's Supper is. And every word that I say, every word that Jesus said, that every action that Jesus did, I'm writing it to you with the intent that it will be a strong rebuke and a stern correction of your despising the church of God and shaming them that have not. Because this is the crux of the problem. Do not forget why he was writing this. It wasn't to again celebrate the benefits of Christ's death. No. He had an entirely different reason. Every phrase in this account is going to be a rebuke against them for what they were doing at the Lord's Supper. Out of time. We'll take it up there and enter the fray once more.